What happens when power meets silent resilience? A black janitor, overlooked and humiliated by a white CEO, flips the balance of power in just 24 hours. What he saw as a powerless woman cleaning his floors turned out to be someone who could dismantle his empire with a single call. This isn't fiction. It's a brutal lesson in racism, power and revenge, told without shouting, but heard across the nation. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. At 5:03 a.m., the silence of Aurelius Tech's shimmering glass tower was broken only by the rhythmic sound of a mop sliding across cold marble. The building stood like a monument to progress in downtown Atlanta. Tall, sterile, and almost entirely white. Floors of innovation, offices of power, meeting rooms where millions were made over lukewarm coffee and under hot fluorescent lights. But long before those rooms lit up, before white collars slipped into leather chairs, there was Celeste Harper. Every morning, without fail, she arrived before the sun. Steel cart rolling beside her, she cleaned the same floors that had long refused to see her. Janitor, cleaner, facility staff. Whatever label they used, none matched the truth of who Celeste Harper once was. She was 52, with a spine straighter than her circumstances and eyes that held quiet storms. Her uniform was simple, navy blue coveralls with CTS maintenance stitched in dull thread across the chest. But beneath it beat the heart of a woman who used to close seven-figure deals, consult Fortune 500 boards, and lead strategy sessions with CEOs. But in this place, no one knew her as the analyst who saved clients from collapse. Here she was invisible. She moved through the building like memory, present but unacknowledged. Her mop knew the way around every corner, and her hands knew which desks belonged to which men, by the fingerprints they left on their screens. She never asked for attention. She never received it. Not even a good morning from the rising sea of white shirts that swept in around 8 a.m., buzzing with ambition and tone-deaf jokes. Aurelius Tech had become one of the fastest-growing tech startups in the South. To the media, it was the beacon of innovation, and to investors, it was a golden goose. But to Celeste, it was a living museum of corporate racism, well-dressed, well-funded, and well-hidden behind mission statements about diversity and inclusion. The elevators had glass walls. The break rooms had smart fridges. The third floor had a meditation pod. But the janitor's closet? It had a rusted sink, peeling paint, and no ventilation. When Celeste first started the job 2 years ago, she thought it would be temporary, a bridge until something better came along. But time has a way of dulling hope when the world insists you're not needed beyond a broom. Celeste learned quickly that at Aurelius, racism didn't wear hoods or scream across streets. It wore polo shirts and whispered across boardrooms. It wasn't loud, it was layered, sophisticated. The way black candidates never made it past the second interview. The way security hovered longer when delivery men were black. The way a white intern once asked Celeste if she could take out his trash, assuming she worked for him. But Celeste never reacted. She just watched, noted, absorbed. Every day, as she mopped past the glass conference rooms, she would glimpse white men in their 30s laughing around presentation boards, throwing around ideas she once could have made sharper. She never hated them, but she never forgot that she'd once been in their place, and that a single false accusation, tinged with racial bias, had snatched it away. Years ago, she had been an executive analyst at a global consulting firm. One wrong email, one white colleague's misunderstanding, one internal investigation that never really investigated. Her world collapsed in less than a week, and with no one to stand up for her, she fell silently into a life that demanded she clean what others left behind. But even in silence, Celeste never stopped seeing. She noticed how Bryce Alton, the CEO of Aurelius, never made eye contact with black staff, how his jokes changed depending on who entered the room, how he addressed the white female staff as ladies, but called the lone black receptionist young woman. No complaint ever stuck to him, no HR probe ever pierced his polished image. But Celeste saw. There was an art to being invisible, and she had mastered it. By 7:45 a.m., she had already finished the 27th floor, tidied the executive lounge, and replaced the soap in the private restroom that only senior directors were allowed to use. The coffee machine sputtered to life. Elevator dings grew frequent. The building awoke, and Celeste faded deeper into the background. She sat for 5 quiet minutes in the janitor's closet, sipping lukewarm coffee from a cracked mug that read "One Mom." Her knees ached, but her mind stayed sharp. On a shelf above her sat a manila folder. Inside were pages of notes she'd written in secret, discrepancies in company spending, photographs of documents tossed carelessly in trash bins, printed emails half shredded by careless interns. She never planned to use them. Until that Tuesday morning. At 8:12 a.m., the air in the lobby changed. Celeste had just finished cleaning the chrome railing near the reception, when Bryce Alton stormed in, flanked by two junior VPs. He moved like he owned oxygen. Tall, confident, tailored to perfection. A man who'd never had to explain himself. As he passed Celeste, he wrinkled his nose. "Can you not clean during business hours? You clean here, not speak. Keep it quiet," he snapped, not slowing his pace. The words hit her like a slap. The lobby froze. One of the junior VPs glanced sideways but said nothing. The receptionist, a young Latina woman named Isabella, lowered her gaze. The elevator swallowed them all, and the doors closed with a mechanical sigh. Celeste stood motionless, mop in hand. The words echoed louder than any scream. "You clean here, not speak." It was how they saw her. It was how they needed her to stay quiet, obedient, unseen, a part of the scenery. Her chest tightened. Not from shock, but from a sadness too old to be fresh. It was the same tone a school principal used when she asked Celeste if her name could be shortened to C. The same tone her last supervisor used when he asked her if she was comfortable around numbers. The tone of erasure, of reduction. She blinked twice, and turned back toward the janitor's closet. But something was different. She didn't feel broken. She felt electric. The folder on the shelf called out to her. The man who had just humiliated her didn't know that the cleaning lady had once audited companies larger than his entire empire. He didn't know she had receipts. He didn't know that in the game of power, she wasn't just holding a mop, she was holding a match. Celeste stood in front of the mirror above the cracked sink and stared into her reflection. For a moment, she didn't see a janitor. She saw the strategist, the fighter, the woman who once restructured failing companies in 48 hours. And now? She had 24 point. That folder wasn't just a diary. It was a blueprint. And today, for the first time in years, Celeste wasn't going to clean quietly. She was going to change everything. Bryce Alton never saw himself as a villain. At 47, he stood as a self-made emblem of American ambition. Tall, athletic, impeccably dressed in slim tailored suits that always smelled faintly of cedarwood and dominance. His face, square-jawed and camera-ready, had graced Forbes' top 30 CEOs to watch before 50. His LinkedIn biography began with a bold claim: disrupting the future by building inclusive tech at scale. But there was one glaring omission. In his 10 years of leadership at Aurelius Tech, not a single black executive had ever held a director title. Not one had been on the leadership board. Not one had spoken in the company's quarterly earnings calls. Yet Bryce believed he was a fair man. Raised in the affluent suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina, Bryce was the product of what he liked to call American classic values. His father was a corporate banker. His mother a poised homemaker who ran the local women's fundraisers. Dinner at 6:30 sharp, lessons on posture and speech, and a heavy dose of "if you work hard enough, you'll get everything you deserve." He carried that gospel into adulthood, into business, into every decision he made at Aurelius. To him, merit was everything. It justified the whiteness of his boardroom. It explained why every VP, every department head, every idea man looked eerily like a yearbook from an Ivy League fraternity. "We hire the best," Bryce often said in investor meetings, casually ignoring the statistics. In his eyes, if black professionals weren't climbing, they weren't trying hard enough. Behind closed doors, Bryce once confided to a peer, "I don't care if someone's purple, as long as they can perform." It was his favorite catchphrase, meant to diffuse any implication of bias, but it reeked of the blindness only privilege could afford, the kind that didn't recognize when the rules weren't built for everyone to play. He walked through his empire like a conductor through a well-rehearsed orchestra. Everyone moved when he entered the room. Everyone laughed at the right parts of his mediocre jokes, and everyone, especially those lower on the ladder, knew not to question the man who could end a career with a single performance review. But Bryce had one weakness. He underestimated silence. He believed that the loudest voices held the most power, that those who stayed quiet were either uninterested or incompetent. He never once considered that someone like Celeste Harper, who greeted him only with a nod and a mop, could have once sat at a higher table than he had ever earned. The truth was, Bryce didn't remember her. Not even from that Tuesday morning. To him, the incident in the lobby had vanished the moment the elevator doors shut. His memory rarely clung to staff who didn't wear suits. Janitors, receptionists, security guards. They were functional shadows, important only in theory, unworthy of attention in practice. He didn't recall Celeste's eyes narrowing, or her pause before returning to the janitor's closet. He didn't notice the receptionist's face flush with silent shame. Bryce simply moved on to the day's agenda: a funding pitch, a podcast interview, and a brief visit from a senator seeking to feature Aurelius as a model for minority hiring. Irony was never something Bryce sat with for long. Inside the executive suite, the atmosphere mirrored his mindset. Cold, sharp, and clinical. Glass walls framed success like a gallery. Every corner was minimalist, strategic. Chairs were leather, conversations were calculated, and ambition was currency. But beneath that polish, an invisible caste system thrived. Entry-level developers sat at shared desks with peeling edges. Black interns were often assigned the overflow projects no one else wanted. The HR department, which prided itself on equity policies, quietly rejected resumes with names like Deshaun or Temeka, citing cultural fit as the reason. At staff mixers, black employees gravitated toward each other, forming invisible islands amidst a sea of whiteness. They joked in hushed tones about the diversity wall in the company brochure, featuring the same 5 people every year. They saw through the carefully chosen narratives, but like Celeste, most stayed silent, because survival often required it. Bryce didn't notice the discomfort. He wasn't meant to. He believed Aurelius was a meritocracy, that if people weren't rising, it was their fault, that every failed promotion, every overlooked talent, every glass ceiling, was simply a matter of work ethic. He never asked why so few black candidates made it through the final interview round. He didn't see the bias in the feedback forms filled out by hiring managers who just didn't connect with certain applicants. To Bryce, it was math, data, business, nothing personal. Except racism is always personal, and Celeste Harper had been keeping track. Back in her closet, Celeste now pored over more than memories. She had printed charts from internal trash bins, financial inconsistencies in budget allocations, emails from department heads dismissing DEI initiatives, meeting schedules that showed only one black employee invited to leadership training in over 2 years. But more than that, she had context. She understood how the systems worked, how regulatory audits were triggered, how anonymous complaints moved through legal channels, and how to use policy language in ways most people never realized could break giants. And Bryce? He was already writing his next keynote speech. True innovation, he planned to say, happens when we bring everyone to the table. The speech had been ghostwritten by a PR intern. Bryce hadn't read it fully, but he liked how it sounded. In the boardroom, he adjusted his cufflinks as his assistant updated him on upcoming meetings. "We've got that compliance check in 2 weeks. Shouldn't be anything, just routine," she said. Bryce waved her off. "Push it to next month. They always reschedule anyway." Outside his glass-walled office, Celeste moved past the hallway with her mop. Her reflection flickered for a brief second on the door's edge. Bryce didn't notice. He never did. But she noticed everything. Every face that turned away. Every intern too scared to speak. Every time HR dodged her resume when she first applied for analyst roles under a different name, before they recognized her. Celeste watched Bryce smile during a call with investors, his voice dripping with charm. She remembered that tone. Years ago it had promised her growth, respect, future, all before betrayal had ripped it away. She wasn't angry. She was calculating. This wasn't about revenge. This was about exposure, about dismantling the myth that companies like Aurelius were built on merit, when in reality they thrived on exclusion masked as excellence. And Bryce, he still had no idea. As he leaned back in his chair, sipping from a monogrammed mug, an email landed in the company's compliance inbox, an anonymous report detailed, thorough, and signed only with 2 words, internal eyes. "You clean here, not speak." The words hung in the lobby like poisoned fog. They didn't echo, they pierced. Not loud but sharp, calculated, dismissive. A quiet violence delivered with surgical precision. Celeste stood frozen, her mop dripping onto the pristine floor she had just polished. The marble shimmered under fluorescent light, but in that moment, everything dulled, the air thinned, the color drained. Around her, people moved, but slowly, carefully, like they were afraid of the moment itself. The receptionist, Isabella, glanced up with wide eyes, then quickly looked down, pretending to adjust her headset. One of the junior VPs shifted uncomfortably, his lips tightening, but he said nothing. Silence spread like a virus. No one defended her. No one interrupted the CEO. Because power wasn't just in the paycheck. It was in who got to speak, and who was ordered not to. Celeste blinked. Once. Twice. Her knuckles clenched the mop handle so tightly her fingers tingled. But she said nothing. Not because she lacked words, but because she understood their weight. And in that moment, the silence was louder than anything she could have said. She had experienced racism in 1,000 small ways. Quiet exclusions, denied opportunities, polite dismissals. But this was different. This was public, raw, brutal, and worse, it was intentional. Bryce hadn't just insulted her. He had defined her, stripped her of identity, humanity, and history in a sentence that fit neatly inside a breath. You clean here, not speak, as if her existence was a disruption, as if her voice had no right to compete with the clatter of success. Centuries echoed in those words. Field songs silenced, black mothers told to lower their eyes, brilliant minds forced into silence in front of typewriters, kitchens, floors. It wasn't just about Celeste. It was about every black woman who had ever been told she was too loud, too angry, too present. She didn't cry, not then. She wouldn't give Bryce the satisfaction. Instead, she breathed through her nose and looked straight ahead, past the reception desk, past the polished walls, past the elevator that had just swallowed Bryce and his entourage. No one apologized. No one offered comfort, but eyes followed her. Cowardly glances, shameful stares. None of it mattered, because something inside Celeste had shifted, not broken, refused to break. She turned her mop back into its bucket and rolled it slowly toward the supply closet. Each step was deliberate, each movement a thread woven into resolve. Behind her, the lobby resumed its rhythm. Phones rang, shoes clicked, laughter resumed, forced and thin, like a dying battery. It was business as usual. Racism rarely disrupted the schedule. Inside the closet, Celeste closed the door behind her and locked it. She leaned against the wall, her breath shaky but steadying. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury, tempered by decades of restraint. She stared at the shelves filled with bleach and industrial soap. They smelled sterile, like a place that tried too hard to be clean. But beneath the fumes lived history, the unspoken caste, the knowing looks passed between black workers in white institutions, the code switching, the forced smiles, the career ceilings with glass so thick it might as well have been stone. Celeste exhaled. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. Instead, she pulled down the manila folder from the top shelf. It wasn't just documents anymore. Over time, she had printed screenshots, audit trails, expense reports that didn't match, memos accidentally discarded but never shredded. She hadn't known what to do with them before. She only collected them because she noticed, because noticing was a habit, a survival tactic. But now? Now it was evidence. She sat on an upturned crate and opened the folder slowly. Her hands were still shaking, but her eyes were locked, focused. One page after another, she assembled a picture. Not just of financial carelessness, but of a company that had learned to thrive under the radar of regulation, protected by buzzwords and the skin color of its leadership. There were emails between Bryce and investors that joked about diversity quotas as PR patches. There were notes from HR referring to candidates who might not fit the executive culture, all tagged with ethnic names. Celeste had seen it all, pieces of it, over months. But now it formed a pattern she understood better than anyone. And suddenly her silence didn't feel like submission. It felt like strategy. She knew that exposing Bryce would take more than just truth. It would take precision. She needed allies, leverage, timing, and today had handed her the first spark. Back in the lobby, Bryce was probably already onto his next call. Maybe laughing, maybe prepping for his podcast segment about leadership and inclusion. He wouldn't think about the janitor. He wouldn't remember her face. That was his first mistake. Her name was Celeste Harper, and she used to be invisible. But no more. She stared at the wall for a long moment, letting her breath slow. Then she stood, straightened her back, reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Inside it was a letter she had drafted over a year ago, but never sent. A formal complaint to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. She had kept it hidden, waiting. Not out of fear, but because timing mattered. Noise wasn't enough. She needed an earthquake. And today, Bryce had handed her a tremor. She slid the letter back into her bag. Not yet, but soon. Before stepping out, she looked in the small mirror above the cracked sink. Her reflection stared back, older, wiser, lined with 1,000 days of being underestimated. But her eyes, they were on fire. She unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway. A junior associate passed her and nodded politely. She nodded back. No one knew what had shifted. No one knew what she carried. And no one would see her coming. Instead of heading toward the maintenance office, Celeste turned sharply, walking not toward the staff exit, but toward the executive floor, and toward the one man in that building who once told her, "If you ever need help, quiet help, I'm your guy." The elevator hummed softly as it carried Celeste toward the executive floor, a space she hadn't stepped foot on since the beginning of her employment at Aurelius Tech. But this wasn't her first time in an executive suite. Long before the navy blue uniform and mops, before her name was reduced to a clipboard on a custodial schedule, Celeste Harper used to run rooms like these. It wasn't a dream or distant fantasy. It was a documented, quantifiable truth. She had once been a lead strategist at Covenant and Quinn, a Fortune 500 consulting firm that serviced high-stakes mergers across the globe. Her reports reshaped entire markets. Her analyses saved dying companies from financial ruin. Clients specifically requested her. Competitors studied her playbooks. For years, her name sat atop internal award lists. And yet, outside those halls, very few people ever heard it spoken. Because Celeste Harper was a brilliant black woman in a world that worshipped whiteness, masculinity, and pedigree above all else. She had always known she would have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. She accepted that, wore it like armor. What she hadn't expected was betrayal from within, from a white peer who saw her excellence not as inspiration but as a threat. His name was Russell Dane, a senior consultant, Harvard grad, mediocre by most measures, but well-liked, well-mentored, and wrapped in the glossy privilege that said, he belongs here. For months, Celeste had outpaced him in metrics, client satisfaction, and innovation. She didn't gloat, she didn't sabotage, she just worked. That was her sin. One Thursday, an email surfaced. It was addressed to a client, sent from Celeste's corporate account. In it, racial slurs were directed toward junior analysts, with disparaging comments about diversity hires and lowered standards. The client was outraged. HR was called. A meeting was scheduled, and Celeste walked in expecting to clarify what had clearly been a mistake. Except they weren't looking for clarity. They were looking for closure. Her name had already been run through the gossip mill, her integrity questioned. The IT department confirmed that the email had originated from her terminal. No one looked further. No one questioned motive. No one considered that Russell had sat at her desk the previous night, under the pretense of checking a forecast model. No one remembered she had spoken out 2 weeks earlier during a leadership meeting, pointing out how all 5 recent hires in the tech division were white males under 35. Celeste was asked to resign, and just like that, her name went from rising star to industry liability. She spent the next year fighting, calling lawyers, filing appeals, but the stain stuck. Her applications were ignored. Her reputation, whispers of temperament issues and possible falsification, killed before it entered the door. And Russell? He was promoted 6 months later. The email was buried, forgotten. Society has always had a way of deleting brilliant black women. Not with erasers, but with silence. Celeste's degrees, MBA from Duke, undergrad from Spelman, suddenly meant nothing. Her network evaporated. Friends became distant. Former mentors issued vague apologies and wish I could help emails. Doors closed without ever unlocking. And beneath it all, she realized that the industry never truly wanted her in the first place. Not when she challenged their comfort. Not when she wouldn't play the grateful silent role. And so, after burning through her savings, watching foreclosure notices arrive, and downsizing her life down to a 1-bedroom apartment on Atlanta's South Side, she took a job no one could sabotage. Cleaning. No boardroom politics. No performance reviews laced with coded language. No one to outshine, because no one cared. It was humiliating at first. She cried in supply closets. She scrubbed floors that her heels used to walk. She kept her eyes low, her thoughts quieter. But over time, Celeste learned to use the silence. She became an observer again. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she had stopped believing that the world would ever protect people like her unless she protected herself first. She remembered every smirk from supervisors. Every sweetheart can you from young interns who didn't know her name. Every time HR skipped over her for an administrative opening, she was more than qualified for. Every reminder that she wasn't supposed to shine here. Not anymore. But her brilliance hadn't dulled. It had simply shifted forms. She used to write risk reports. Now she tracked risks of a different kind. Financial missteps, HR oversights, hiring bias. She took notes like she once drafted strategy. She saw things others missed, patterns, loopholes, vulnerabilities. And she waited. That afternoon, after her quiet walk toward the executive floor, she found an open door. Marcus Lang, the company's compliance officer, sat behind a screen filled with spreadsheets. Marcus was a quiet man. Black. Early 40s. Engineering background. Kept to himself. Always polite. Rarely engaged in small talk. But 2 years ago, during a chance conversation by the loading dock, he'd said something that stuck. This place runs on pretense. If you ever need help, quiet help, I'm your guy. She hadn't needed it then. She did now. Celeste didn't speak to him that day. She didn't need to. She just noted the exit path, the door code still unreset after 3 quarters, the stack of audit templates on his desk. She would return when the moment demanded it. That evening, The sun dipped low over Atlanta, casting a reddish hue across Celeste's small apartment. She sat at her kitchen table, her mop and gloves now resting quietly by the door. The room was dim, cluttered, humble, but her mind was sharper than ever. She lit a candle, not for ambiance, but for focus. Then she opened her old leather briefcase, the one she hadn't touched in over a year. From it she pulled a file. Faded, marked with years of dust and memory. The front label was written in all caps, underlined in red. Confidential, urgent. Inside were documents from her case at Covenant and Quinn. The email headers, the employee timelines, her own notations in the margins about inconsistencies. She had kept it all, not because she thought justice would come, but because some things are too important to forget. She spread the pages across her table like puzzle pieces, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a janitor. She felt like an analyst. Her eyes froze on one printed email chain. 3 names stood out. One of them now sat on the board of Aurelius Tech. The pages were still spread across Celeste's table, lit only by the flickering flame of a small candle. Her apartment was still. No television murmuring in the background. No music to soften the tension. Just the steady rhythm of her pen against paper, and the hum of long-held rage transforming into method. She wasn't angry anymore. She was calculating. The name she had circled in red was Nathaniel Greer. He'd been a senior partner at Covenant and Quinn during the scandal that destroyed her career. A man who had sat in on every HR meeting, nodded along to the false claims, and signed the paperwork sealing her professional death. Now his face was listed on Aurelius Tech's board of directors. That twist wasn't just coincidence, it was fuel. Celeste knew corporate structures like second skin. She had spent years untangling companies from liability and financial exposure. What she hadn't expected was to end up scrubbing the marble floors of a business connected to the same machine that had chewed her up and spit her out. But maybe fate wasn't cruel. Maybe it was strategic. She spent the next hour mapping out the skeleton of Aurelius Tech's infrastructure, departments, leadership, funding pipelines, internal oversight chains. The company had expanded rapidly over the past 5 years, propped up by venture capital and a carefully curated narrative of inclusive innovation. But expansion without structure leaves cracks. And Celeste knew exactly where to press. On the second page of her notes, she drew a triangle. At the top, Bryce Alton. Below him, a horizontal line connecting Marcus Lang and Nathaniel Greer. 2 men, one a potential ally, the other a confirmed enemy. She didn't need both. Just one would do. Celeste had been silently gathering data for over 6 months. Not out of vengeance, but out of habit. She had seen inconsistencies in Aurelius's purchase orders, duplicate vendor payments, rounded travel reimbursements, executive perks written off as departmental expenses. At first she assumed it was corporate sloppiness, but the deeper she looked, the more it felt intentional. She had access most didn't. Every shredder bin, every abandoned print job, every misfiled document left in the recycling tray. They all became puzzle pieces, and now she was fitting them together. There were 4 clear violations of internal compliance protocols. 2 of them, if paired with testimony, could trigger a full-scale federal audit. But the real key wasn't in catching Bryce embezzling. It was proving the company's structural racism, not just as a moral failing, but as a legal liability. That's where Marcus came in. Celeste folded her hands and stared at the page listing the compliance protocols for whistleblower submissions. She remembered the exact clause. Any employee, regardless of rank or role, may submit an internal ethics complaint with legal protection under federal guidelines. She had the documentation, the patterns, the receipts. What she needed now was timing. The next board meeting was scheduled in 2 weeks. Investors would be present. Auditors wouldn't arrive until the quarter's end. That meant she had a narrow window to create a storm loud enough to disrupt operations, without implicating herself directly. She would need an internal voice. And Marcus Lang, quiet as he was, had always felt like a man who understood unspoken codes. She thought back to that night by the loading dock, months earlier. It had been raining. Marcus had helped her carry a busted vacuum cleaner into storage. She remembered the way he'd glanced around before speaking. "They watch you," he'd said. "Not because you're cleaning, because they know you see things. They hope you stay quiet." Celeste had just smiled, tired. He had leaned in closer. "If that ever changes," he whispered, "you don't have to fight alone." At the time, she hadn't believed him. Now, she couldn't afford not to. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and began building her plan. Phase 1, document synthesis. She would digitize every piece of evidence she had, label it by type, racial discrimination, financial fraud, HR violations. Phase 2, secure Marcus. Not to act, yet, but to listen. To confirm whether he had access to executive performance reviews and board communications. Phase 3, anonymous submission of a whistleblower packet, flagged internally, triggering mandatory risk evaluation. But even that wasn't enough. Bryce was too insulated. She needed external pressure. Media was risky, but regulators weren't. Celeste took a deep breath and opened her laptop. She hadn't logged into her encrypted drive in over a year. The interface was outdated, but functional. She uploaded the first 20 pages of notes and set a passcode, Shatterglass 52. She paused, hands hovering above the keys, staring at the monitor. This wasn't about bringing Bryce down. It was about dismantling a system that believed janitors were disposable and white CEOs were untouchable. A system where Nathaniel Greer could erase a black woman's career and still sit on a board spouting equality metrics for press kits. Celeste wasn't a martyr. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was about to become a threat. It was nearly 2:30 a.m. when she finished the first data packet. She saved it to a flash drive and wrapped it in a small piece of cloth, tucking it inside a worn jewelry box, her late mother's. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in months. At 2:34 a.m., she picked up her phone. There was only one number she knew would still be awake. Someone from the old world. Someone she hadn't spoken to in 4 years. A woman named Delia Hartwell. A journalist, now working freelance, once blackballed from her media job for trying to expose discriminatory hiring practices at a tech firm. Celeste hesitated. The screen glowed. Her thumb hovered over call. Delia owed her. Years ago, Celeste had leaked internal files that helped Delia win a case. No money changed hands, just trust. And trust, in this war, was more valuable than power. She tapped the screen. 1 ring. 2. Then Celeste? Her voice cracked, groggy but alert. "It's time," Celeste whispered. Silence. "Is it Greer?" Celeste nodded, forgetting for a moment Delia couldn't see her. "Yes, and Bryce Alton. I've got documents, real ones." A breath on the other end. Measured, controlled. "I'll be in Atlanta in 48 hours. Celeste didn't say thank you. She knew Delia wouldn't want it. She simply ended the call, placed the phone face down, and stared at the box holding the flash drive. Tomorrow, she would speak to Marcus. But tonight she had drawn the blueprint. And when morning came, the cracks in Aurelius would no longer be invisible. 20 minutes later, as Celeste drifted into shallow sleep, her phone buzzed once. A new message from an unknown number. "We know what you're planning. Stop." Marcus Lang had mastered invisibility in ways that were both survival and strategy. At 43, he was the kind of man people at Aurelius Tech noticed without remembering. Polite nods, sparse conversation, always on time, never loud. His desk was tucked in the corner of the third-floor compliance office, strategically close enough to the action, far enough to be forgotten. He didn't mind. In fact, he had designed it that way. As the company's compliance officer, Marcus had seen things most executives didn't want him to see, or assumed he wouldn't. Performance reviews coded with bias, budget lines fluffed with executive retreats labeled training seminars, DEI statements scrubbed clean of real targets. His job was to monitor, log, and report, but only if the system wanted things reported. And Aurelius rarely did. Marcus learned early that being a black man in compliance was like being a firefighter told not to touch the hose. You could see the smoke, hear the alarms, but if you reached too far, you were suddenly the problem. So he kept quiet. Until now. Celeste Harper stepped into his office just before 9 a.m., the morning after the anonymous threat landed on her phone. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with intent. She didn't knock, just stood there, waiting for him to look up. Marcus raised his head slowly, pausing his keystrokes. He recognized that look. It was the same one he'd worn the day he realized the company he'd once believed in would never protect people who looked like him. "Close the door," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She did. Marcus leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "So," he murmured, "you're making a move." Celeste nodded once. "It's already started." He motioned for her to sit. She didn't. Instead, she placed a small USB drive on his desk, wrapped in a folded paper towel. Quiet, deliberate. "I need confirmation," she said, "of systems, of timelines, of board vulnerabilities." He didn't reach for it. "Why now?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "Because someone finally told me I wasn't allowed to speak, and because the man who destroyed my career, Nathaniel Greer is sitting on the board of this company. A flash of recognition crossed his face. Then something sharper. Guilt. Marcus exhaled slowly. I knew your name sounded familiar, he admitted. I was at Covenant and Quinn, too. Junior analyst. I saw the fallout. Celeste blinked. Then you knew what happened wasn't real, she said, voice hardening. I did, Marcus whispered, and I stayed silent. The tension between them thickened like fog. But instead of anger, Celeste looked at him with something closer to understanding, because she'd been in that silence herself. Not because it felt right, but because it felt safe. You saw it then, she said. You see it now. What are you going to do with it? Marcus stared at the drive. For years he had rationalized his silence. He wasn't in a position of power. He had student loans, aging parents, rent that rose faster than his salary. He told himself he was surviving, that the system couldn't be changed, that he was just one man. But here was Celeste Harper, once erased, now reborn, and she was placing the first weapon of truth in his hands. He picked up the drive. What's on this? Enough, she replied. Financial fraud, discriminatory hiring, expense abuse, and a detailed timeline of internal cover-ups. Marcus didn't ask how she got it. He didn't need to. He'd suspected for months that someone was watching. He just never thought it was the janitor. That's not what scares me, he said finally. Celeste raised an eyebrow. What scares me, Marcus continued, is that most of this won't shock anyone. These kinds of violations, they're built in, and when it's exposed they'll circle the wagons. They won't investigate. They'll protect. That's why it has to be both internal and external, Celeste said. They won't listen to me, but they might listen to someone already inside. Marcus sat back, digesting that. I've been sitting on a report, he admitted. Internal ethics concerns. Ignored. I've flagged HR practices. Bryce overruled, twice. They already think I'm paranoid. Then let's make them afraid, Celeste said. The silence between them turned electric. For the first time in years, Marcus felt something shift in his spine, something upright, unbent. He had spent his entire career maneuvering through white spaces by shrinking himself. Now Celeste was asking him to amplify. He slid open his drawer and pulled out his personal flash drive. I'll match yours with mine, he said, but we do this carefully. We do this smart. No fingerprints, no public spectacle, until it's irreversible. Celeste nodded. That's the plan. Where does Delia Hartwell come in? Her eyes widened. You know about Delia? Marcus smirked. She interviewed me once, back when I tried to report racial bias in my grad program. She lost her job over it. Celeste nodded. She's coming. I'm giving her everything. But first we drop it internally. Let Bryce scramble. Let him react. When they go into damage control mode, that's when we go wide. Marcus rubbed his chin. You really thought this through. I've had years. They didn't shake hands. They didn't hug. There were no dramatic words of alliance. Just a quiet mutual understanding. Silence had served them once. Now it would serve the fall of Aurelius Tech. Celeste turned to leave, but paused at the door. They sent a message last night, she said. Someone knows. Marcus stiffened. You think it's internal? She nodded. Feels like Bryce, or someone close. He leaned forward, voice dropping. Then let's give them a reason to panic. As Marcus plugged the drive into his system, a pop-up appeared instantly. Security access alert. Session logged by administrator. Someone was already watching. Aurelius Tech moved with the same daily precision it always had, at least on the surface. The espresso machines whirred at 8 a.m. sharp. Emails poured in with subject lines like action items and client retention strategy. Interns scrambled between meeting rooms carrying color-coded reports for directors who barely glanced at them. But beneath that polish, something had shifted. It was subtle at first. An email thread flagged by IT for unusual deletion activity. A forgotten meeting room reservation suddenly rescheduled with legal review tagged on the internal calendar. A senior project manager requesting vacation days, only to retract them hours later with a vague excuse. Family situation, may need to step away soon. No one said it out loud, but everyone could feel it. The building, once filled with sterile confidence, now buzzed with a strange tension like a string pulled too tight, humming on the edge of snap. The first audit began internally. Routine, officially. Quiet, unofficially. Marcus Lang had submitted a whistleblower packet disguised as a procedural flag. No names, no accusations. Just raw documentation layered with cross-references, print logs, and fiscal inconsistencies in the Q2 financials. He routed it through a virtual compliance portal, double encrypted, and triggered a mandatory review. It looked harmless, boring, even. But within it were breadcrumbs leading toward policy violations that, when pieced together, painted a picture of systemic neglect. Aurelius Tech prided itself on lean operation models, but lean in their case often meant exploitative. Underpaid temp workers, ghost vendors tucked in under false LLCs, diversity spending, reallocated to conference parties where the only black attendees were hired musicians. Marcus didn't speak to anyone about the report. He simply waited and watched. It didn't take long. 2 days after the submission, the company's external accounting firm flagged an expense irregularity. A line-item reimbursement of $4,000, marked as training development, had been spent on Bryce's private golf retreat in Aspen. The finance lead, Hannah Kim, was the first to break routine. She stopped by Marcus's office with a closed file under one arm, face pale. "Did you catch this already?" she asked, voice low. Marcus looked up slowly. "Catch what?" "This reimbursement trail. It's messy. If the board sees it..." "They won't," he said calmly, "unless someone makes noise." She hesitated, then walked away without another word. But the crack had widened. Word trickled through the lower departments that something was coming. Not a fire, not a scandal, just something. Team leads began requesting status updates with more urgency. HR doubled their review cycles. An unusual number of LinkedIn profiles were updated overnight. Still, Bryce Alton remained oblivious. He had spent the week preparing for a keynote speech at a tech summit in Boston. His assistant had booked first-class flights, arranged private car service, and prepped a printed deck highlighting Aurelius Tech's ethics-first leadership culture. On the morning of his flight, he strolled through the 27th floor in his usual brisk confidence, buttoned up, Bluetooth in ear, nodding at nothing and no one. He passed Celeste in the hall without a glance. Just 2 days ago, he had humiliated her in front of staff. And still he didn't recognize her. Celeste kept her eyes down, her face unreadable. But inside, she was counting seconds, counting the pace of the unraveling. When Bryce arrived at his office, there was an envelope on his desk. No email, no subject line, just a white envelope marked "Urgent Internal Risk Assessment." He frowned, tearing it open with one motion. Inside were 4 pages, dense with legal language, citing clause after clause from the company's own handbook. At the top, notice of pending internal ethics review, triggered via anonymous portal submission. He blinked. It wasn't uncommon for small issues to be flagged through the system, misfiled travel reports, conflict of interest checks. But this felt coordinated. The letter wasn't from legal, it was from compliance oversight, routed through a third-party legal firm, standard for whistleblower protections. Bryce read the first paragraph 3 times. Per company policy and federal regulation under the Whistleblower Protection Act, an anonymous submission has triggered a mandatory internal review of executive financial activity, hiring practices, and diversity fund allocations. His breath caught for a second. Then he scoffed. "This is nothing," he muttered. He buzzed his assistant. "Get Marcus Lang in here. Now." But Marcus didn't come. Instead, an email pinged Bryce's inbox 10 minutes later. Subject: temporary out-of-office notice. From Marcus Lang. Message: per compliance policy, I am recusing myself from direct participation in this review to maintain neutrality. Please refer to the interim liaison assigned to this audit. Bryce's eyes narrowed. Recusing himself? That wasn't protocol. Unless... He leaned back in his chair, suddenly aware of the faint sound of an air vent above, the same sound that had always been there. But now it felt louder, like the building itself was breathing differently. He grabbed his phone, dialing internal security. "I want access logs pulled," he said. "Last 2 weeks, every floor, every badge swipe. I don't care if it's janitorial, pull it." The voice on the other end paused. "Is there a specific concern, sir?" Bryce clenched his jaw. "There might be a leak." A beat of silence. "Understood." He hung up and rubbed his temples. A leak. The word scratched at his pride. Leaks didn't happen to companies like Aurelius, not under his leadership. He controlled the narrative. Always. And yet, he didn't know where this had come from. Not one suspect. Not one warning. Just this creeping sense that he was being watched. Outside his office window, the Atlanta skyline stretched wide, glittering with promise. But for the first time in years, Bryce didn't feel on top of it. He felt under it. Celeste, 2 floors below, finished cleaning the break room with calm efficiency. The mop glided across the floor like clockwork. No one noticed that her name tag had been switched that morning, deliberately, a small act of defiance. a signal to herself. You are no longer who they say you are. And upstairs, Bryce Alton, CEO, builder, architect of prestige, sat alone with 4 sheets of paper, and the creeping awareness that the foundation beneath him was no longer stable. His assistant stepped in quietly and handed him a flash drive. This came from legal, she said. You're going to want to see what's on it. It's labeled Internal Eyes. The conference room on the 29th floor of Aurelius Tech was known internally as the Vault. It was where sensitive discussions happened, merger talks, investor pivots, disciplinary reviews. No phones, no personal laptops, access granted only through pre-cleared credentials. Celeste Harper had never been inside. Until today. She pushed her janitorial cart slowly into the hallway leading to the vault. Her uniform crisp, hair tied back beneath her cap, gloves pristine. To anyone watching, she was simply there to sanitize high-touch surfaces, a new initiative following an internal memo on health compliance. No one questioned her. They never did. That was the power of invisibility. When whiteness framed who belonged in the room, black labor could move through it like wind, present, essential, but rarely acknowledged. The door to the conference room was propped open slightly. Inside, murmured voices bounced across glass walls. Bryce Alton sat at the head of the table, flanked by his CFO, HR director, legal counsel, and 2 board members, Nathaniel Greer among them. The flash drive labeled Internal Eyes had already been inserted into the main screen. Celeste rolled her cart toward the corner, pretending to wipe the doorframe. On screen, the documents flicked through in sequence: falsified expense reports, discriminatory hiring metrics, internal emails with phrases like optics cleanup and HR won't catch this. Celeste knew every slide. She had built it. She watched from the corner, feigning disinterest, as Bryce's face tightened. What is this? He snapped, flipping through faster now, trying to catch a rhythm. Where's the author? Where's this data even coming from? Nathaniel, visibly sweating, avoided eye contact. The room's energy shifted. Bryce turned to the company's legal counsel, Amina Daniels, a sharp black woman in her early 40s whose reputation in compliance law was ironclad. She didn't speak yet. She was scanning the documents slowly, methodically, not shocked but not dismissive either. This isn't a prank, Amina said quietly. This is curated, structured, and legally timed. If these documents are real, you have 3 separate compliance violations and a possible class action lawsuit on the table. Bryce leaned back, staring hard at the screen, his knuckles pale. Who brought this to our attention? He demanded. Before anyone could answer, Celeste bent slightly, tapping her cart's digital sanitizer monitor, a screen installed for real-time health reports. It beeped softly, drawing eyes. She straightened slowly, meeting Amina's gaze for the first time. Amina stared at her, longer than expected. Recognition flickered. Bryce didn't even look. I believe, Amina said suddenly. We've seen this style of audit before. She didn't explain further, but Celeste knew exactly what she meant. Back when Amina was a junior associate at a former firm, she had once reviewed an emergency report from Covenant and Quinn, Celeste's last project before her career was sabotaged. The formatting, the phrasing, the logical layering. It was distinctive. Celeste's audit mind was like a fingerprint. You couldn't duplicate it. She turned quietly, pretending to wipe down a nearby shelf, but left behind a small slip of paper tucked under the screen projector. A final breadcrumb labeled Source Chain, Confidential Eyes Only. Amina spotted it but didn't move. Instead, she leaned toward Bryce. We need to take this seriously, she said flatly. Shredding it will not be an option. Bryce scoffed. It's anonymous. We can discredit it. Find whoever. We won't discredit anything until I've vetted it, Amina said sharply. And if this goes public before we act internally, we won't just lose stock, we'll lose protection. Nathaniel shifted, clearly uneasy. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. Celeste caught the motion, noted it. The boardroom wasn't just watching slides anymore. They were watching each other. And slowly, the truth was seeping in. Someone inside had helped. Someone had broken the code of silence. And the deeper fear, they didn't know who. Celeste turned to leave, her job done, her presence unremarked. But as she passed behind the wall of frosted glass, Amina followed with her eyes, just long enough for the realization to bloom fully. It was her. Amina didn't say a word, but her lips pressed together in a silent acknowledgement only a black woman could give another. I see you. Down the hall, Celeste moved quickly toward the elevator, heart steady. Her movements were clean, exact, but inside, adrenaline pulsed like electricity. This was the first domino. In Marcus's office, a new report had just uploaded. a complete cross-reference file connecting the whistleblower data to known corporate misconduct cases nationwide. The implication: Aurelius wasn't an isolated failure. It was a node in a pattern. Marcus reviewed the file silently, then slid it into an encrypted folder labeled Phase 2. Downstairs, HR received an anonymous message through their ethics hotline. Check candidate files cross-referenced by racial demographics. Look at interview scoring discrepancies over 5 years. And in the executive boardroom, silence had fallen again. Bryce stood, staring at the wall. He turned to Nathaniel. "You said we were clean." Nathaniel stammered. There were lapses. Yes, but nothing we couldn't." "You vouched," Bryce hissed. "And you ignored protocols," Amina snapped, standing now. "You overrode HR on 6 hires, forced 2 resignations, and funneled vendor contracts through personal connections. This is bigger than sloppy ethics, it's criminal exposure." Bryce rounded on her. "You don't get to accuse," but she cut him off. "I don't need to accuse, the paper trail already has." Everyone froze. Then Amina looked around the room, calmly. "We'll need to know where this originated. Soon." As the room tensed, the door creaked open again. A junior associate stepped in, holding an envelope with shaking hands. This just came in, for legal. It's postmarked yesterday, from someone named Harper." At 6:15 a.m., the sky over Atlanta was a bruised shade of gray, heavy with pre-storm tension. Inside Aurelius Tech, the first employees to arrive sensed something was off. Not wrong, just fragile, like the building had developed hairline fractures no one could see, but everyone could feel. Celeste Harper was already on site, pushing her cart past the elevators as if it were just another day. Her expression was calm, her pace measured. She wore the same uniform, same gloves, same tagless nameplate, but inside she felt something different, something almost electric. Today was the day the truth stopped whispering. Upstairs, Bryce Alton had barely slept. He arrived early, suit jacket slung over one shoulder, the letter from Harper still in his briefcase. He hadn't opened it. Not yet. Fear disguised as arrogance told him it was bluff, a final jab from some disgruntled nobody trying to make noise. He didn't have time for jabs. His morning began with a flurry of internal emails. Urgent follow-up from HR. Request for legal review from compliance. Concerning chatter from comms. It was noise, he thought. It had to be. He had survived worse. Market dips, hostile shareholders, even a near-merger collapse. But this felt different. It was quiet, coordinated, and most disturbing of all, anonymous. Then, at 9:04 a.m., the glass doors of Aurelius Tech's lobby slid open, and the federal regulators walked in. There were 3 of them, 2 in suits, 1 in a gray windbreaker marked OIG, Internal Oversight Division. No badges flashed, no words shouted, just a folder passed calmly to the front desk with the words Preliminary Inquiry Notice stamped in red. The receptionist froze. "Who should I call?" she whispered. "Your legal counsel," one of them replied. The storm had officially begun. Bryce was mid-call when his assistant barged in. "You need to come downstairs," she said, her voice stripped of polish. "Now." Minutes later, he stood face-to-face with the lead regulator, who offered a firm handshake and a direct gaze. "We're not here to accuse," she said. "We're here to evaluate." Discrepancies were flagged, financial, procedural, and internal equity-related. "We'll need access to Level 3 financials, HR logs, and directorial communications within the hour." Bryce blinked. "This is absurd. We've had nothing but clean audits." "This isn't an audit," she interrupted. "It's a protection protocol, triggered by whistleblower statute, federally supported, and legally binding." A chill crept up his spine. "We'll comply," he muttered, turning sharply toward the elevator. But the damage had already begun. By noon, 2 key investors, Gray River Capital and Rutherford Equity, had issued statements pausing any further expansion discussions with Aurelius Tech. The press releases were terse but devastating. Words like pending clarity, concerned by early findings, and exploring alternative ventures dotted the language like strategic landmines. Bryce stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. Sweat soaked through his undershirt. He stared at the unopened envelope from Celeste, still resting on his desk like a quiet dare. He picked it up, tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed, centered, clean. "You erased me once, but this time, I own the narrative." Bryce dropped the page like it burned. For the first time, he realized this wasn't a bluff. It was a blueprint. The first media ping came at 1:37 p.m. A small tech blog posted a headline. Anonymous insider exposes racial bias, financial misconduct at Aurelius Tech. Within minutes it spread. First to social media, then to mainstream platforms. Screens in the break room buzzed with live coverage. Words like whistleblower, equity fraud, and systemic exclusion flashed beneath slow-motion clips of Bryce speaking at last year's Diversity in Tech Summit. Employees stared. Some whispered. Others quietly opened job boards. Celeste passed them, unseen. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She wasn't interested in spectacle. She had no desire to see Bryce drag through the digital mud. She wanted impact. And that impact was happening in real time. Marcus Lang had already filed the second internal packet, this one linking Bryce's override of compliance recommendations to policy violations across 5 departments. The timestamp matched the document reviewed by regulators just hours earlier. Amina Daniels, the company's legal counsel, called an emergency executive meeting at 2 p.m. Bryce didn't show. He was in his office, staring at a dozen browser tabs, each one worse than the last. One headline caught his eye. Whistleblower reported as former consultant, targeted in corporate frame-up, now a janitor at Aurelius? His chest tightened. He read the subhead twice. Sources suggest Celeste Harper, formerly of Covenant and Quinn, may be the anonymous whistleblower shaking the foundation of one of Atlanta's largest tech firms. He stood, walked to the mirror, stared at himself. It was unthinkable, impossible, that the woman he had dismissed in a lobby, "You clean here, not speak," was the same mind tearing his company apart piece by piece. And yet, it made sense. He remembered the way she looked at him that morning. Calm, focused, not broken, calculating. The walls began to close in. His phone buzzed. A message from Nathaniel Greer. "You need to fix this, fast." Bryce didn't reply. He turned to the monitor, opened his email. 30 unread messages. Another ping, this one from legal. Subject: urgent. Board demands immediate response to whistleblower allegations. Another ping, and another. Then, a text. From an unknown number. Just 5 words. "Check the news. CH." He reached for the remote, turned on the TV. And there it was. Breaking. Live. U.S. Senate Ethics Committee opens preliminary probe into Aurelius Tech discrimination claims. He dropped the remote. Celeste had just gone federal. As Bryce tried to steady himself, the building's internal comm screen lit up with a single message. Mandatory town hall. All staff must attend. 4 p.m. Hosted by Legal and Compliance. And Celeste, still in uniform, walked calmly toward the same elevator Bryce would have to take. The Aurelius Tech cafeteria had never been this silent. 400 employees packed shoulder to shoulder, their plastic chairs squeaking beneath shifting weight, their eyes fixed on the large screen mounted on the front wall. It usually streamed company promos or leadership updates. Today it pulsed with the CNN logo and a red banner that read, "Breaking: CEO of Aurelius Tech faces civil charges. Racism allegations." The anchor's voice was calm but cutting. Federal regulators have confirmed an ongoing investigation into financial misconduct and discriminatory practices at Aurelius Tech, following a whistleblower's detailed internal report. Sources suggest the company may face civil penalties and potential litigation for Title VII violations. There was no talking, no joking. Even coffee cups had been set aside. What began as workplace gossip had now bloomed into full-scale catastrophe, and no one knew who to trust. In the front row, Bryce Alton sat with his back unnaturally straight, jaw clenched. He was dressed immaculately as always, blue tailored suit, burgundy tie, every inch the polished executive, but his posture betrayed him. His confidence was cracked, and the weight of a million unspoken questions pressed down on him like concrete. He looked around, eyes darting from face to face. Where was the leak? Where was the traitor? His mind raced through possibilities. Amina? Marcus? Someone in legal? But each option came with consequences he couldn't afford. The public narrative had already shifted, and worse, the board wasn't answering his calls. On screen, a second reporter joined in. "We've now confirmed that the whistleblower's packet included financial documentation, hiring discrimination data, and evidence of a targeted takedown of a former black executive consultant at a separate firm, now employed at Aurelius as janitorial staff. While the whistleblower remains anonymous, several sources suggest this individual may be at the heart of the exposure." Murmurs rippled through the room. A janitor. Bryce swallowed hard. His eyes involuntarily scanned the edges of the cafeteria, and that's when he saw her. Celeste. Standing quietly at the back of the room, mop in hand, uniform unassuming. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't smiling. She simply watched, calm, still, knowing. And now, seen. It was the first time Bryce truly looked at her. Not as background, not as labor, but as something else entirely. As a threat. But she wasn't moving. She wasn't talking. She didn't have to. The media was doing all the speaking for her. The town hall began 20 minutes later, hosted by Amina Daniels, Marcus Lang, and a silent representative from the Office of Corporate Oversight. The room remained tense. Legal protocol dictated no direct admissions, only language framed around investigation and cooperation. Amina took the microphone, her tone professional but uncompromising. The company is cooperating fully with federal regulators. No retaliatory actions will be taken against any staff connected to the ongoing review. All employee communications are protected under whistleblower law. She paused. Let me be clear. Racial bias, discriminatory hiring, and financial fraud are not abstract failures. They are systemic patterns, and they live or die by our silence. Eyes turned again toward the back. Celeste remained motionless. Bryce stared forward, jaw tight. Amina continued. If you have seen, heard, or experienced something that contradicts the values this company claims to hold, now is the time to speak. Because silence no longer protects you, it protects them. The cafeteria erupted, not in noise, but in stillness. A deeper kind of silence, not fearful, but expectant. It was clear something had broken open. By late afternoon, Aurelius was trending on Twitter. Not the kind of trending a brand wants. Hashtags spread like wildfire. Harper the Hammer. The Hammer. Janitor Justice. Clean house at Aurelius. Celeste's name hadn't been officially released, but the internet didn't need it to identify her. Posts began surfacing. A blurry shot of her in the elevator. A quote attributed to her. You clean here, not speak. Being dissected by activists and analysts. Think pieces poured in. Corporate racism isn't loud. It's institutional. How black women are erased in the workplace until they burn it down. The janitor who understood systems better than the CEO. Outside Aurelius HQ, reporters gathered. Employees were interviewed off record. Stories began stacking. A black engineer passed over 3 times for promotion despite exceeding benchmarks. A Latina receptionist told to tone it down in client-facing spaces. A security guard reprimanded for calling out a racial slur from a visiting VP. The entire building was a minefield of buried harm. Now, it was exposed. And Bryce? He was running out of time. Inside his office, Bryce made calls to crisis consultants, brand managers, attorneys, anyone who could offer a narrative to drown the truth. But nothing stuck. Every attempt to spin was countered by another article, another tweet, another internal leak. He grabbed his phone, opened the staff directory. There had to be someone to blame, someone to point at. His finger hovered over Marcus Lang's name. Then Amina's. Then, Celeste Harper. His thumb tapped the screen but paused before he called. What would he even say? That he didn't know she was capable of this? That her silence had been deceptive? That she, a janitor, had no right to wield this kind of power? But none of those statements would hold up. Not anymore. He turned away from the screen, pacing. He needed a scapegoat. Someone high enough to take the fall. Someone public-facing. Someone with enough of a digital presence to redirect the fury. But every person he considered had already covered themselves. He'd made too many enemies. Too many forgotten names. And now they were all remembering him. As he dialed his PR team, his screen flashed with a new internal notification. Request from board, emergency session tonight at 7:30 p.m., mandatory. Agenda, interim CEO discussion. Celeste Harper didn't seek attention. Not when she was erased. And not now, as the tide began to shift. Even as headlines rippled through national media, and whispers grew into conversations behind closed doors, she kept moving the same way she always had. Quiet, measured, unseen. But now invisibility felt like armor, not exile. She used it to move through the wreckage with control, collecting pieces of a broken empire she had helped unravel. Inside Aurelius Tech, the silence around her wasn't indifference anymore. It was reverence. Employees began noticing things they hadn't before. The way Celeste's eyes seemed to know more than they let on. The fact that she never looked surprised when new information leaked. The subtle nods she exchanged with Marcus Lang in the hallway. The stillness with which she stood during the town hall, as everyone else leaned forward, hungry for answers. She became a symbol without declaration. Among black employees, her presence felt like revelation. Not in grand speeches or Instagram-ready soundbites, but in the way she existed unapologetically in a place that had tried to define her out of existence. "I think it's her," whispered Angela from payroll, one of the few black women in management. "The whistleblower. The one they keep talking about." "Can't be. She's just the intern started," then paused. "She's not just anything." Stories began appearing in Slack channels and anonymous forums used by minority tech workers. Posts about an unnamed janitor who knew financial law like a partner at a firm. One post titled, "The Woman Who Brought Down a Boardroom with a Mop," was shared over 100,000 times in 2 days. Another simply read, "She saw us, and now they have to." The most viral comment under it, "Her mop wasn't her weapon, her mind was." Inside his dim office, Marcus Lang watched the threads multiply. He wasn't on social media much, but this wasn't social. It was testimony. A digital archive forming in real time, a collective memory reclaiming what corporate silence had tried to erase. He leaned back in his chair, conflicted. He had all the files, the dates, the documentation. Enough to prove, without a shadow of doubt, that Celeste Harper had orchestrated one of the most precise internal disclosures the tech world had ever seen. But he also had her silence. She had never asked for fame, never asked to be the face of the reckoning. And yet, every passing hour made that silence harder to protect. He knew the media would come, not just the blogs or Twitter sleuths, but the real ones, the hungry ones. And when they did, Celeste wouldn't be ready, because people like her were never allowed to be ready. She had done the work, but they would want the spectacle. His fingers hovered above the keyboard. One click, and every encrypted file would go public. Anonymous still, but unmistakably hers. A digital shrine to her precision, her logic, her audacity. But was that what she wanted? He closed the screen. Not yet. That evening, the break room emptied early. Celeste sat alone at a corner table, a cup of lukewarm coffee in hand. The mop leaned against the wall nearby. It had become more than a tool. It was a symbol, one that still made her uneasy. She wasn't comfortable with praise. She had spent too long being erased to believe recognition would feel like justice. A younger black employee passed by Jordan from IT. He paused, then walked back to her table. "You don't know me," he said softly, "but I've seen you here every day." Celeste nodded, expression gentle. "I just wanted to say whatever you did, thank you." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she asked, "Why now?" He looked puzzled. "What do you mean? Why did it take this to be seen?" Jordan's face fell. "Because this place taught us to survive, not speak." She nodded once. "Change that." He walked away without another word. But the look in his eyes said everything. The next morning, Marcus stepped into legal with a sealed envelope. It contained a full summary of the whistleblower documentation, marked voluntary disclosure, in support of internal equity investigation. He had left Celeste's name off, as promised. But by then it didn't matter. The media had already found the scent. A leak from within the boardroom had triggered a cascade. Someone, perhaps a panicked executive, had spoken off record. A journalist from a major outlet had begun circling the story, asking the right questions. Celeste had spent years avoiding the spotlight, but she was about to stand in it, whether she wanted to or not. Later that evening, back in her small apartment on Atlanta's South Side, she peeled off her uniform and folded it gently across the armrest of her couch. The TV murmured in the background. Another segment about corporate reckoning in tech. Her name still hadn't been spoken. Good. She liked it that way. There was peace in being unknown. She brewed tea and opened the window, the cool air brushing against her skin like something cleansing. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just breathed. Then 3 sharp knocks at the door. Not rushed. Not random. Precise. She froze. Set the cup down. Walked slowly toward it. Peeked through the peephole. A woman stood outside. Mid-30s. Brown coat. Press badge clipped to her lapel. Delia Hartwell. Celeste's breath caught. They hadn't spoken in years. Not since that cold fall day when Celeste anonymously slid files under Delia's office door, leading to a Pulitzer-nominated expose on racial hiring bias in federal contractors. Now she was here in the flesh. On her doorstep. Celeste opened the door just a crack. Delia didn't smile. She simply held up a recorder and said, "Are you ready to tell the world what they did to you?" Celeste didn't open the door all the way. Just enough for her eyes to meet Delia Hartwell's. The journalist stood with the kind of patience only years in truth-seeking could teach. Her recorder remained in her right hand, but her left stayed at her side, an unspoken gesture of respect. "I'm not here to pressure you," she said softly. "I just want to hear your side. When you're ready." Celeste studied her face. It had aged gently since they last crossed paths, lines of wear layered with resilience. She didn't look like someone chasing a headline. She looked like someone who remembered. Celeste didn't speak. She stepped back and opened the door. Delia stepped in, quietly, no questions asked. They sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where, not long ago, Celeste had laid out files and war plans. Now, it held only a pot of coffee and 2 chipped mugs. Celeste poured in silence. Delia clicked the recorder but placed it face down. "You don't have to tell the story," she said. "You are the story." Celeste stirred sugar into her mug, then leaned back. "I didn't do this for applause." Delia nodded, but it came anyway. Celeste didn't smile. Her voice stayed even. "I didn't do it for vengeance either. I did it because I knew I could, and because no one else would." That night, Delia didn't publish a word. She left with a single quote and Celeste's condition: use it when it matters, not when it sells. By morning, Delia honored her word. In a nationally syndicated column titled "The Woman Who Turned Silence into Power," she referred to Celeste only as the strategist in blue. The piece struck a nerve, because it didn't glorify rebellion. It honored endurance. The public responded with rare honesty. Celeste began receiving handwritten letters from black women in other cities, from teachers, from medical techs, from legal aides, each one echoing the same sentiment: "I see you. You gave me something back." Church groups asked to honor her. Advocacy groups offered awards. TV hosts emailed her with subject lines like, "We'd love to celebrate you live." She declined them all. She didn't want to become anyone's mascot. She had lived through erasure. She had no desire to be immortalized in anyone else's narrative. But she did accept one invitation from the South Atlanta Women's Cooperative, a small but mighty group of Black and Latina professionals who hosted a community panel titled "Power Unseen." Celeste didn't take the main seat on stage. She sat in the front row, sipping coffee and listening. When someone finally asked from the mic, "Are you her?" she looked up, raised her mug, and nodded once. That was enough. The impact continued to ripple. Aurelius Tech's leadership structure collapsed within 2 weeks. Bryce was placed on indefinite administrative leave, pending federal inquiry. Nathaniel Greer resigned from the board under pressure. 2 HR executives were quietly let go. The company tried to pivot, rebrand, rephrase. But it was too late. The foundation had cracked too wide. And still Celeste didn't gloat. She mopped floors until her final day. Not because she had to, but because she wanted the last week to end on her terms. On her last day, Jordan from IT handed her a small notebook. Inside were notes from employees who had never spoken to her, but who had watched, learned, and found something in her fight that changed them. One message read, "You reminded me that dignity doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just keeps showing up until the walls fall down." Celeste packed her things into a small canvas tote. No plaques, no memorabilia, just her mother's bracelet, a copy of the whistleblower report, and a business card she had found slipped under her door 2 days earlier. It read, "Leona Patel, Senior Partner, Catalyst Venture Group. Back. Call me when you're ready to build something." She had stared at it for hours before pocketing it. Now, as the sun rose over her neighborhood, bathing her apartment in a quiet golden light, she sat on the porch with her coffee and pulled out the card. She had spent years being told who she could be, what rooms she could enter, what tables she could sit at, if any. And yet, she had dismantled an empire without ever raising her voice. Her redemption wasn't about media, fame, or apology. It was in the control she'd reclaimed. In the systems she now understood more deeply than ever. In the power to choose what came next without anyone else's permission. Her phone buzzed once. Unknown number. She answered, calm. "Miss Harper," the voice said, warm and composed. "This is Leona Patel from Catalyst Venture Group. I was wondering if we could talk about a proposal, and about legacy." Celeste didn't respond immediately. She watched the steam rise from her coffee. Then smiled, small but certain. "Tell me," she said, "how much power are we talking?" Celeste pushed open the heavy glass door of her modest new office on a crisp Monday morning. Sunlight spilled across the lobby, illuminating a sleek logo painted on a reclaimed wood wall. Harper & Co. Consulting. The sign felt like a title shift, not just in her own life, but in the life of everyone she intended to uplift. As she stepped across the polished floor, she heard the soft hum of possibility, A receptionist phone answered in 2 languages, the low murmur of a strategy meeting behind frosted glass, and laughter, bright unguarded laughter echoing in the hallway. The tension of the past months, the audits, the boardroom revelations, the shame imposed by Bryce felt distant now, dulled by the purposeful energy of her own design. Each space in the new office reflected Celeste's vision. Open floor plan, collaborative pods where identities and ideas mixed freely, bright break rooms with community artwork, and a library wall lined with works by Black thinkers and trailblazers. James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, Ta-Nehisi Coates. The decor wasn't mere decoration, it was affirmation. Every visual and spatial detail carried a message. Here, you belong. As she walked to her small inner office, she paused to observe her team in action. Miriam, her lead researcher, typed notes while nodding at a colleague. Luis from Digital Analytics leaned in close to a junior intern, explaining how to track social impact metrics. There was a sense of earnest engagement, an energy Celeste hadn't felt since her consultant days before everything fell apart. It all started with one decision: to build rather than beg. Celeste had received offers, even public praise, in the aftermath of the Aurelius scandal. But she had watched diversity hires tokenized, celebrated for photos on social feeds, then swept under the rug at budget time. She didn't want validation from a system built to exclude her. She wanted her own system. She wanted to redefine what success meant, on her terms. She remembered the long nights drafting that first business plan, services carving niche around equity audits, structural assessments, leadership coaching for underrepresented employees, and bespoke workshops on microaggressions and unconscious bias. She'd priced it so agencies wouldn't see it as charity, but as smart business. The money mattered, it always did, but the mission mattered more. She wanted firms to pay for accountability, to pay for inclusion that actually lasted. The first paying client hadn't come from grand introductions or VC portfolios. It had come through a small Atlanta nonprofit, a group dedicated to supporting Black families displaced by gentrification. They needed help with leadership development, how to get funding, how to build inclusive boards, how to stave off institutional racism. Celeste and her team spent weeks drafting plans, facilitating conversations, and measuring outcomes. The result? Board members got diverse, funding pipelines opened, community trust grew, and slowly, word slipped out. In a city full of tech giants and traditions, a small nonprofit found real, measurable equity. The ripple reached corporate ears, and one ripple is all it takes in quiet waters. Within 6 months, Harper & Co. had 4 corporate contracts and 3 mid-sized nonprofit clients. Revenue doubled every quarter, not because Celeste had advertising dollars, but because of referrals grounded in trust. Her firm also hired intentionally a group of Black women analysts with Ivy League MBAs who didn't fit corporately engineered diversity slides, but who understood cultural nuance, a transgender consultant with deep experience in nonprofit leadership, a Cantonese-speaking ESG specialist. They all brought something vital, lived experience. They brought lived pain and pride. When they gathered in the conference room, calling themselves the table, they weren't just colleagues, they were architects of change. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Celeste stepped into the lobby to greet a local journalist arriving for a feature in the Atlanta Chronicle. Her firm had been spotlighted in the paper's Sunday Faces of Impact section, praising their inclusive hiring, racial equity audits, and emotionally intelligent leadership training. The reporter, a young Black woman named Aishia, was visibly excited. As they sat on light-up wicker chairs in the lobby, Aishia asked about Celeste's decision to call the firm Harper & Co. "The name," Celeste said, leaning forward, voice soft but firm, "is an homage to every Harper who sweeps floors, dreams of more, is dismissed. I'm building a company that ensures they don't fade." Her words hung in the air like an invocation. Aisha smiled, scribbling notes. She asked about the team's makeup, the obstacles they faced, the results they'd delivered. Celeste answered, honest, unapologetic, hopeful. But beneath the sweetness of recognition, a quiet tension whispered. This wasn't storybook progress. It was still insurgency. There were board members in other companies watching the Chronicle story. Investors quietly scrutinizing contracts. Some would respond with applause, others with resistance. Progress invited backlash. Celeste felt the old pulse of fear, that fierce thrum she knew when power flickers but hasn't toppled. That evening, she joined the table for their weekly reflection. The team shared victories and struggles. Miriam described a moment when a client executive asked, "Is Harper & Co. strictly for DEI optics?" and then blanched at her measured response. "If that's why you want us, you won't find eyes to hide behind." Luis talked about designing internal scorecards that clients reacted to with shock, and the transgender specialist offered a mini workshop on pronouns and workplace dignity. Celeste listened, proud, then added her own reflection, how far they'd come, how far they'd still go. They ended in silence, each person in the circle breathing as if they could taste freedom for the first time. No food, no champagne, just solidarity. The next morning, Celeste arrived to find a letter taped to the lobby console. She picked it up with careful fingertips. The envelope had no stamp, just a computer-printed label, no return address. Inside was a single page, black text on white, scant words. "You can't build a seat where none exists. Best leave it, Ms. Harper." No signature, no branding, only threat wrapped in condescension. For the moment, the lobby seemed to hush. The hum of printers, the bamboo plants by the reception desk, even Aisha's discarded notebook on the floor. Celeste folded the paper and slipped it in her purse. Then she straightened her shoulders. A storm was coming, but she'd already learned how to stand in one. She didn't alert the press. She didn't call police or lawyers. She waited. She watched. But that morning, she assembled the table again in the conference space. She placed the letter on the meeting table like a gauntlet. Heads turned. Miriam narrowed her eyes. Louise sat forward. Someone asked, "What is it?" Celeste looked around. Steady. "A reminder," she said softly, "that power resists when it's challenged. That systems defend themselves." She paused. "We're not here just to consult. We're here because we proved it works, and that scares people." There was a ripple in the group. Grim, resolute unity. The room felt electric. They'd expected resistance. Now they felt its fingertip. Over the following week, they intensified client outreach, deeper surveys, executive training, strategic planning for systemic change. Each win multiplied into another, and ripple became wave. Harper & Co. was becoming the gold standard for equity consulting in Atlanta, and whispers of Celeste's work reached beyond Georgia's borders. One evening, after a long day of meetings and interviews, Celeste lingered at her desk. The office was empty, overhead lights dim. She sipped tea and thumbed the Chronicle article. At the bottom, framed on her desk, was a photo. The nonprofit leadership team who'd first believed in her. Their smiles reminded her why she'd built this. Then, beneath the photo, her phone vibrated. A message. A name she never expected to see. Bryce Alton. No context, just 3 words. "Applying for job." Celeste stared at the phone, the words flickering like an unexpected code. The name still triggered something. Old anger, old shame, old power switching hands. But now she held the leverage. Bryce Alton, CEO whose empire she helped destabilize, who'd humiliated her in front of everyone, was trying to join her company, not knowing she ran it. She swallowed. Confusion flared into curiosity, then steel, the kind she hadn't felt since walking away from Aurelius. She raised her head, looked at her reflection in the dark window pane. In the glass, a woman had built her own table, and now, a ghost from the old table was asking for a seat. Celeste sets her phone down, her mind racing. Should she reply? And if she does, what will she say? The interview had been over for 3 days. Bryce Alton had left the sleek office of Blueprint Equity Partners with a stiff jaw and a strained smile. The meeting had not gone the way he imagined. He'd walked in expecting a second chance, hoping that his repackaged resume and rebranded tone, humble, evolved, might land him a way back in. But the moment he saw the nameplate Celeste Harper, founding partner, his composure cracked. She hadn't spoken much during the panel. She had let her team do the talking, sharply, surgically. The trans man on her left, the young black woman to her right, the Latina analyst beside them. Each of them carried questions wrapped in logic and velvet. They asked about ethics, inclusion, leadership under crisis. Bryce stumbled through every answer. He kept glancing at Celeste, trying to find familiarity, an opening, a lifeline. But she gave him none. Her eyes didn't burn. They didn't mock. They simply watched. Not like a woman getting revenge. Like a woman keeping receipts. The silence after the interview had been deafening. No call, no update. Then at exactly 7:43 a.m., as Bryce sipped burnt coffee from a paper cup at his downtown sublease, the email landed. Subject: regarding your interview, Blueprint Equity Partner. He clicked it without thinking. The message was simple. Stark. Corporate clean. Dear Mr. Alton, we appreciate your interest in joining Blueprint Equity Partners. After careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with other candidates whose experience more closely aligns with the values and trajectory of our firm. We wish you the best in your professional pursuits. Sincerely, Executive Recruitment Team, Blueprint Equity Partners. He read it twice, then a third time. He was about to close the tab when he noticed a small attachment. A single-line PDF. He opened it. In the middle of the page, typed in bold serif font, "This time, you clean up your mess." There was no signature, but he knew. He knew. Bryce stared at the screen for a full minute, motionless, not angry. Not yet. First came disbelief. Then the slow creeping nausea of humiliation. It was sharp, cold, the kind of blow that didn't just bruise, it rewrote things. It wasn't just a rejection. It was an echo. He could still hear his own voice from that day in the lobby. You clean here, not speak. He had dismissed her without hesitation, convinced of his authority, his status. He'd spoken down to her as if she were beneath the very floor she cleaned. Now she was running the company that rejected him. And worse, he had no idea how far her reach extended. He stared at the email again. The line at the bottom pulsed in his vision. You clean up your mess. For the first time in months, Bryce didn't feel angry at her. He felt seen. And he didn't like it. At Blueprint, Celeste didn't discuss the email with anyone. She didn't need to. Her team understood the poetry, the irony, the justice. Marcus passed by her office that morning, tapping gently on the glass. Want me to forward the bounce back? She shook her head. It's done. He nodded, then smiled faintly. He never apologized. He never will. They stood in quiet understanding. Bryce's punishment wasn't unemployment. It was irrelevance. Later that week, Celeste stood in front of the firm's glass facade, sipping her usual black coffee. She wore charcoal slacks and a white blouse, her curls pinned neatly. Her name now hung beside the entrance, etched into brushed steel. Not flashy. Permanent. Across the street, foot traffic moved in waves. Consultants, junior staff, freelancers on scooters. In the flow, she saw a familiar figure, Bryce. He was walking fast, head down, avoiding eye contact with the world. A briefcase. No tie, shoulders hunched. He didn't see her.
You didn't recognize the building.
He passed by like it was any other office. Celeste watched him, unmoved. It was a peculiar kind of closure, to watch a man so consumed by power that he never looked up long enough to see who he'd stepped on. Even now, he walked past his consequence without noticing. That, she thought, was the most fitting ending of all. He would never see her rise, because he was still looking down. As she turned to go inside, her assistant rushed up behind her, breathless. Celeste, she said, there's a documentary crew here from New York, and they said you didn't return their call. Celeste raised an eyebrow. I didn't. The request from the New York documentary team was one of dozens. They wanted a 3-part series, a retelling, a visual triumph, a face on billboards, voices over slow piano chords, a redemption arc they could sell. Celeste declined. She didn't need a camera to validate what she'd done. Some things were bigger than visibility. Some revolutions are most powerful when they're felt, not flaunted. Blueprint Equity Partners continued to grow, not as a monument to Celeste, but as proof that brilliance lives everywhere, especially in the places power overlooks. Her name remained on the letterhead, but she rarely took interviews. When asked why, she answered simply, real change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sweeps quietly through marble halls. Meanwhile, the final chapters of Aurelius Tech unraveled with public precision. Bryce Alton issued a formal statement of resignation 2 weeks after his rejected application for personal reasons. The board called it a transition, the media called it a fall from grace, and his former employees called it what it truly was. Justice delayed, not denied. The company tried to rebrand, hiring a new CEO with a safer, softer profile. They issued apology campaigns, shuffled leadership, and donated heavily to causes they had once ignored. It didn't work. Their valuation dropped 68% in 9 months. Major clients exited. Lawsuits followed. The marble lobby where Celeste once pushed a mop was now a revolving door of consultants, risk managers, and panicked PR teams. No one stayed long. By year's end, Aurelius quietly sold its assets to a competitor, one whose diversity score was ironically half of what Celeste's firm had achieved in 3 quarters. And still, she said nothing publicly. Her silence remained louder than their statements. In the South Atlanta neighborhood where Celeste still lived by choice, word of her story traveled differently. Barbershops, corner stores, coffee houses run by first-gen immigrants. People spoke her name with reverence, but not fame, not in the viral sense. They knew her because she came to their fundraisers, donated to their school supplies drives, sponsored workshops on ownership over optics. She wore jeans and cardigans, drove a hybrid, still shopped at the same market her mother once took her to. She didn't need a new zip code to feel powerful. She'd changed the one she lived in. Every Thursday afternoon, Celeste hosted a mentorship circle from her office's common room. No suits, no jargon, just folding chairs, flip charts, and raw honesty. She called it the table they never set. Each week, 5 to 7 black and brown entrepreneurs came through, some wide-eyed, some worn down. She taught them contracts. She reviewed their pitch decks. She explained how to turn their ideas into leverage. But most of all, she taught them this. Your silence is not your weakness. It's your strategy, until it's time to speak. One afternoon, a 19-year-old named Kareem raised his hand, nervous but bold.
You really took down an entire company, Ms. Harper?
He asked. Celeste smiled.
I just exposed what was already broken.
Another mentee leaned in. How did you know it would work? I didn't, she said, but I knew I was done waiting. In an unexpected twist, a year after Aurelius's collapse, a small business magazine published a quiet exposé titled The Ghost Architect of Justice. They had pieced together the story through unnamed sources, court records, and internal leaks. Celeste was never quoted, never shown, but the article named her impact plainly. The final paragraph read, "We still don't have a picture of Celeste Harper, but we don't need one. Her legacy isn't built in sound bites. It's coded in policies, in boardrooms redesigned, in startups that now hire differently because someone once refused to stay invisible." Celeste read the piece once, then closed the tab. 2 years after her final shift at Aurelius, she walked through the lobby of Blueprint HQ, now upgraded to a multi-floor space in a renovated brick building. The floors were polished wood. The cleaning staff was union-backed and paid double industry standard. Every employee had access to executive mentorship, regardless of title. And on the back wall, carved into steel, was the firm's credo. Built by the underestimated, designed for those who never got the first invitation. She didn't attend the ribbon cutting. Let Marcus do the speech, let the team celebrate. She watched from her office, hand over her heart, not for the success, for the clarity, for the silence she had once been forced into, and the structure she had birthed from it. A month later, she sat across from a young woman named Nia, a founder building an app for formerly incarcerated women. Nia spoke with fire. She had big plans, bigger dreams. But she paused, then whispered, "Miss Harper, what if they don't take me seriously?" Celeste leaned forward. "They won't. At first. That's how the game is set." Nia's eyes dropped. Celeste touched her hand. "So what do I do?" "You build your own game," she said softly. "Then you flip the board." The impact multiplied. Within 3 years, Blueprint Equity had helped launch 76 new ventures. 45 were black or brown-led. 32 were women-founded. 17 had been rejected by every major VC firm prior. Every one of them had now hired at least one employee who had once been told they weren't a cultural fit. And behind it all, Celeste stayed off camera. Her power was never in being seen. It was in building things no one could tear down. Then, one evening, while closing her laptop, she saw an email. Subject: Legacy Application. Student Summit at Spelman College. It was a scholarship panel asking her to review submissions from young black women entering tech. She scrolled through essays. One of them stopped her cold. It read, "I want to be like the woman who showed us that justice doesn't need a microphone, just a backbone and a strategy." The signature? Tay Harper, her niece. Celeste covered her mouth with her hand, eyes glistening. The story was over. But it had already sparked 100 more. And somewhere in an underfunded school library, another girl, quiet, brilliant, unseen, is opening a notebook, drawing her own blueprint. If Celeste Harper's journey moved you, even in silence, then this is the kind of storytelling the world needs more of. We're telling the stories they try to bury, the voices they try to silence, and the systems we must challenge. So if you believe in justice, in redemption, and in the quiet power of truth, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who still needs to hear that their silence doesn't mean weakness.